The electronic screech materialized prior to any other event. A sharp, computerized squeal creeping upward from the small audio monitor lodged firmly against the edge of her head. At this specific moment, the representative had elevated her dual palms in an unsuccessful bid to mute the clamor, waving at the vacant air beside her cheek as though battling a relentless bug unseen by all other attendees. A lonely sheet of parchment lay inverted perfectly in the middle of the massive timber table. She had assertively slid that exact manuscript in his direction roughly 2/3 of an hour earlier, steering it with a pair of digits and an extremely confident smirk. It encapsulated her challenge. She had intentionally written it manually, making certain her exact phrasing was logged into the formal transcript so that no detractor could later charge her with being unclear. Currently, the speaker maintained one solitary finger softly pushing against the rear of that paper, looking like a scholar securing his position in a lengthy book. He presented no grin, and he did not raise the decibel level of his vocalization. "You presented a question to my attention, Congresswoman," he enunciated with absolute clarity. "I guaranteed you I would supply a thorough reply. I am approaching the finale." The diminutive receiver maintained its piercing squeak. She eventually succeeded in extracting it, clutching the dormant, tiny contraption within her grasp, looking completely unsure of exactly where she should dispose of it. To fully grasp how a meticulously designed ambush, a trap she had invested a full 7 days perfecting, one she was completely positive would end his governmental career instead of her own, had disastrously backfired, we must reverse the timeline. We are required to journey back to the instance 2/3 of an hour earlier, a period when she was absolutely certain she was the individual holding the sword. "Mr. Speaker, I offer my appreciation for your attendance this afternoon," she had proclaimed, the fabricated cordiality in her voice specifically tuned for the surrounding broadcast cameras, a reality obvious to every single watcher in the grand room. "I plan to maintain this as extremely direct because I presume the populace of this nation has become fatigued by legislative posturing, and I absolutely resonate with that feeling." She had seamlessly pushed the handwritten parchment across the flat surface. It coasted over the shiny wood and stopped just outside of his grasping range. "That represents my inquiry. I have manually inscribed it to avoid any future misunderstandings. I demand that you vocalize it to the room, and afterward, I demand a response, not an ethical sermon, but an undeniable reality." She had individually organized this precise setup. That was the element the whole assembly was currently trying to digest. This was not your typical parliamentary hearing where the head of the committee grills an anxious testifier. Rather, it showcased the active Speaker of the House voluntarily assuming a chair across from a minority faction representative to absorb her frontal assaults. The setting was teeming with media personnel. Broadcasting teams from 3 massive channels were positioned densely, and the citizen observation deck was packed tightly straight to the safety barriers. Onlookers murmured that it was a complex snare she had painstakingly assembled for him. Nobody could understand why a person usually so strategic had willingly marched directly into the hazard. She had fastened her earpiece, the standard issue radio unit provided by the board for tracking the live stream, and she stretched her hand to push it deeper inside her auditory canal. It was a slight, automatic anxious habit she would repeat dozens of occasions during the session without even noticing it. Concurrently, positioned without drawing attention in the 4th tier, sat an individual wearing a bland gray jacket, holding a creased sheet of paper securely hidden inside his chest pocket. He was an observer who had traveled on 2 distinct municipal transit vehicles to be there, although absolutely nobody in the room was currently conscious of his pilgrimage. The speaker picked up the manuscript. He analyzed it quietly initially, his lips shaping the syllables in a scarcely noticeable movement. The entire assembly focused on his silent review, and that shared expectation created a thick, oppressive quietness that no volume of screaming could have successfully produced. Finally, he read it aloud for the official record in a balanced, flat pitch, inserting zero passion into the recitation. "The question states," he initiated, "Mr. Speaker, people of your political leaning absolutely relish questioning my loyalty to this republic. Therefore, I shall make this effortless for you. Point out one solitary phrase, merely a single sentence, inside the Constitution of the United States that I have ever violated. Name it exactly in this moment, or surrender to the fact that this investigation has consistently been motivated by the color of my skin, and the spiritual tenets I practice." He softly situated the parchment down onto the desk. "That is a weighty inquiry, Congresswoman," he pronounced. "That is a remarkably fantastic question. Honestly, I have waited for an extensive period for an individual to deliver that precise test to me so openly, carrying their personal autograph." He flattened the manuscript purposely using 2 fingers, similar to ironing out an essential invoice you were required to keep for your accounting. "Therefore, I am preparing to issue a total response to the absolute entirety of it, and I would graciously ask that you permit me to finish without interjection, considering that you invested such massive effort in composing it, and I would loathe to mischaracterize your stance." She leaned back into her upholstered seat, broadcasting massive contentment. She had effectively ensnared him on the open transcript, compelling him to debate her devotion based upon a parameter she had singularly constructed. In her calculation, the clash possessed merely 2 possible conclusions, both of which she had thoroughly rehearsed. Alternative 1. He faltered through an ambiguous, broad justification of national pride and flag-waving, which she would immediately extract into a trending video clip showcasing a conservative official incapable of naming a lone legal breach. Alternative 2, he overcompensated, striving to seize upon an invalid complaint, which she would masterfully trim into a trending broadcast emphasizing systemic anti-Muslim sentiment inside the corridors of government. She had built a figurative passageway holding precisely 2 doorways, and she was positioned resolutely as the guardian to both exits. However, she had totally overlooked the reality of a third approach for managing an interrogation, plainly responding to the challenge directly. If you have constantly been told that your personal identity prevents you from asking for equitable replies, stay tuned, because this is the exact moment a figurehead decided to answer the fundamental question instead of swallowing the lure of the foundational allegation. And you will definitely desire to observe the aftermath. Strike the approval icon to guarantee this tale finds the viewers who desperately require to watch it. Presently, let us head back to the interrogation chamber. The speaker did not reach for a giant, overfilled notebook. There existed no dramatic display of storage boxes or towering piles of documented proof. His resources consisted purely of the single page she had supplied, along with an exceptionally thin cardboard enclosure, maybe a fraction of an inch wide at maximum. He laid his hand flat on the top of the fastened folder and maintained it closed for the present moment. "I committed 2 decades of my existence working as a legal professional before I ever pursued political office," he stated distinctly. "My expertise was constitutional jurisprudence, deeply centered upon the First Amendment. Do you comprehend the realistic, everyday truth of that occupation? It means that I committed 20 years passionately protecting the legal entitlements of citizens to voice remarks that I individually considered deeply disgusting. That was my obligation. A person speaks a sentence that causes your stomach to roll, yet you stand upright in a judicial setting, and you aggressively fight for their inherent entitlement to vocalize those exact syllables. Because the precise second we authorize government entities to mandate acceptable versus forbidden expression is the second our shared freedom dies." He halted, allowing the gravity of the declaration to sink in. "I am providing this introduction to you, Congresswoman, because I require you to completely understand the character of the man you're confronting this afternoon. I am the absolute final human inside this legislative building who will ever tell you that you are prohibited from voicing your opinions. My whole career was established upon the exact contrary philosophy. Then we are in consensus that this whole operation is a pointless endeavor," the representative interrupted. And there it emerged, the first hint of the victorious smile she automatically utilized whenever she assumed she had gained the dominant position. "Negative, ma'am. We do not agree on that foundation, largely because your inquiry did not ask whether you held the lawful entitlement to speak your views. You specifically demanded I identify a boundary you have crossed." He softly touched her written manuscript. "You penned these phrases yourself. Thus, permit me to begin my reply, and you are welcome to alter my perspective if I chance to misunderstand your meaning." He opened the slender binder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. His actions lacked any theatrical flourish. He manipulated it as commonly as grabbing the upper document from a pile at a copying device. He shifted his viewing glasses, pushing them slightly further down the arch of his nose. "The afternoon you were formally inducted into this governing assembly," he recollected, "you placed your palm upon a religious text belonging to your patriarch. I feel obligated to mention that exact element, as it is extremely pertinent to the path of this dialogue. He raised his sightline. In the past, there existed people who incorrectly claimed that a lawmaker could exclusively take their pledge upon a Christian scripture. You probably remember those detractors, and those people were factually erroneous. They were completely incorrect regarding basic constitutional statutes. If I had operated as your legal representative during that era, I would have proudly issued that exact ruling directly to their visages. The core manuscript of our nation declares it in clear phrasing. No spiritual test shall ever be demanded as a prerequisite to any position. You were completely authorized in deploying that religious text. Furthermore, any person who tried to convince you otherwise held a core misconception of the exact constitution they claimed to defend. He permitted that affirmation to float in the space. I require that viewpoint to be permanently recorded into the official transcript before we advance a lone inch deeper, because I am readying to put your history under severe examination. And it is vital you comprehend that this upcoming critique holds zero connection to the sacred book you used for your pledge. The climate within the room had transitioned into a condition of complete quietness. Even the veteran reporters had halted their typing, detecting the fundamental energy of the chamber turning, although they could not yet predict the final trajectory of the movement. Yet here is the essential condition concerning that swearing-in event, Congresswoman. The importance exists not simply in the tangible text placed under your hand. The genuine gravity lies completely upon the exact promises that leave your lips while your palm is situated there. He initiated reading from the pulled document, his speed calculated and steady. Support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. He meticulously set the typed text downward, matching it exactly border to border with her handwritten test, placing the pair of papers side by side on the table. Foreign and domestic. That embodies the contract. That is the whole of the responsibility. You are not granted the privilege of selecting. I have not on a single occasion, she started to object. I have not finished my answer to your prompt, ma'am, he interjected. His inflection remained surprisingly empty of hostility. It reflected the peaceful conclusion of easing a portal closed instead of violently banging it. You explicitly asked that I utilize my time and supply precise details. I am presently supplying those specific details. He fluidly removed the next piece of parchment from his binder. If you have continuously watched a precise person take apart a careless idea, you acknowledge that they never leap instantly for the throat while the adversary is actively prepared for the blow. They act systematically. They compel the adversary to participate in their individual destruction. There exists a public speech you gave, the speaker pointed out. A civic meeting in your hometown. These constitute your precise verbalized words correctly recorded. I specifically opted not to use the trending version spreading on digital social networks because the interpretation on that particular broadcast was flawed, and I absolutely declined to participate in flawed debates. I tracked down the precise transcripts of exactly what you actually expressed. He read the passage. Quote, "The U.S. government will do what we tell the U.S. government to do. We should have that confidence in ourselves. As long as I am in Congress, no one will take Somalia's sea." He looked past the upper edges of his spectacles. Currently, my aim is to stay completely fair toward you because impartiality is the sole standard that makes this assessment worthwhile. You were speaking about a geopolitical harbor deal, a valid international conflict, a real issue of external relations. You possess every entitlement to maintain a strict political viewpoint on that topic. I am not striving to paint your behaviors as some secret plot organized in a concealed underground room. Later that night, a television news group tried to analyze the interaction utilizing their standard techniques. 3 commentators yelling over one another concerning accusations of prejudice, congressional accountability, and arguments about the inherent justice of the committee's layout. This messy structure lasted for roughly 4 minutes before the host, who had clearly scrutinized the unedited tape during his transit, lifted a palm and suddenly stopped the intersecting chatter. He vocalized the irrefutable truth that 0 of his panelists wanted to concede. He declared that arguing the justice of the setting was pointless. Because the representative herself had established the boundaries, she had composed the exact inquiry, and she had manually shoved it across the desk to trigger the confrontation. There was no alternate universe where she could paint herself as the casualty of a surprise attack. The rival analysts became quiet. The broadcast portion finished early. Unavoidably, that instance also turned into a trending snippet. Out in the stone hallways right outside the hearing chamber doors, a probing journalist succeeded in stopping a seasoned Democratic official, a male who had reliably voted in agreement with the Congresswoman on numerous instances throughout the decades. He fiercely demanded his identity remain concealed, and he obviously analyzed the corridor in both paths before speaking, a standard habit for lawmakers getting ready to speak a harsh reality. When he ultimately conversed, his speech was quiet and fast. "We fiercely cautioned her against executing this," he admitted. Absolutely everybody cautioned her. You do not deliver a dedicated constitutional attorney an open-ended inquiry concerning the Constitution and invite him to consume all the duration he desires. That is not a snare for him. That constitutes a monumental present. He pivoted his head in complete shock. She dedicated 6 entire years influencing the populace into debating over whether her detractors' inquiries were valid, totally escaping the necessity to actually respond to them. Today, he plainly responded to her. There exists no tactical retaliation against a male who plainly delivers the response. In a flash, the official disappeared down the hallway before the journalist could even elevate his sound-capturing device. Concurrently, back in the Midwestern city, a local resident who operated a privately owned vehicle repair shop, a male who had happily cast his vote for the representative in 3 successive political races, watched the tape on his mobile device while resting against his client desk. He felt no feeling of triumphant confirmation, and he did not experience any intense treachery. Honestly, he would have found it difficult to verbalize exactly what sentiment was flooding over him. He had relocated to this nation many years prior, holding barely more assets than the representative possessed upon her immigration. He had established his modest enterprise utilizing strictly his empty palms. He flipped his device screen down onto the transparent display case and stayed motionless for a prolonged duration. Eventually, he picked it back up and reviewed the interaction once more. The exact portion where the official explained that the boundary she surpassed was not written in a judicial statute, but instead lived in the massive space dividing a lawful entitlement from basic morality. He considered that difference profoundly. Shortly after, a client walked into the garage, causing him to stow the gadget and get back to his physical work. He held back from speaking about the recording with anybody, but the deep epiphany filled his mind for the rest of the daylight hours. At the exact same time, the observer in the bland jacket completed his dual bus transit back to his domicile. He chose not to activate his listening devices. Instead, he gazed emptily out the window glass at the passing municipal illumination, maintaining the battered, rounded-edge photograph of a female's face safely tucked in his upper garment pocket. Throughout the latter half of his trip crossing the shadowed urban expanse, he pushed his palms solidly against his torso, right above the pouch, and kept it settled right there. He did not cry tears, not exactly, but the feeling was incredibly close. He had effectively achieved the resolution he commuted to secure. An individual had finally spoken the reality inside a space packed with operational cameras, admitting that while a lawmaker holds the lawful protection for their speech, the living citizens hold an identical protection to clearly recall precisely who spoke those syllables. And the speaker, staying true to his innate character, performed the actions characteristic of incredibly precise males, movements totally empty of performance. He failed to collect the whole of his arranged binder. He purposefully left the copied pledge, the text of her address, and the last paper perfectly on the table for the administrative workers to later throw away. He stretched his arm and collected exactly one single sheet of paper, the manual challenge. Her initial inquiry? The identical manuscript she had arrogantly pushed in his direction with 2 fingers and a self-assured smile merely 2/3 of an hour earlier. He creased it neatly exactly down the middle line and seamlessly slid it away into the inside compartment of his tailored coat. Following that sequence, he stood up from his seat and left the room without speaking a lone extra word to anyone in attendance. He walked past the strobing lenses, disregarded the reporters yelling his identifier echoing through the hallway, and strolled right past the tiny, muted audio device that sat discarded on the table where she had abandoned it. It constituted the single object she had abandoned. He, similarly, had secured exactly what he showed up for. It represented her individual test, written in her personal script, and it fit flawlessly inside a lone compartment. If this story struck a chord with you on a deep tier, tap the approval icon so the system's mathematics pushes it toward the people who have anticipated for decades to watch a manipulative inquiry answered with pure truth. If you maintain the belief that a person's lawful entitlements and their ethical behavior are two hugely separate ideas, and that acknowledging this difference is the absolute heart of the matter, follow this broadcast immediately and deposit a single word into the discussion area. Write the word daylight. Send this material to a person who will experience its reality in their deepest framework. Your viewpoint possesses massive worth, and the subsequent time an individual tries to persuade you that your history prevents you from asking for replies, remember the most quiet person in the interrogation space, the male who plainly delivered the answer. "I recognize your viewpoint," she countered, her inflection surprisingly icy. "However, you specifically declared that the federal administration will carry out whatever commands we deliver to it. And the crowd you presented that guarantee to did not encompass your voting region, ma'am. That did not constitute a regional hometown voter base. You were engaging with that exact audience as a consolidated group, assuring them that the independent administration of the American nation would shift its international tactics concerning an overseas shoreline, strictly depending on their unified directive." He flattened the parchment flush against the timber. "And my attention repeatedly goes back to two exact terms printed on this matching manuscript: foreign and domestic. You took a serious pledge to place this exact country above all others, yet you later stood in front of a crowd and promised that this central country would receive tactical instructions from an overseas power." He dropped his spectacles still another small measurement. "I am not formally charging you with breaking a legal code, Congresswoman. I am a legal professional. I use that exact vocabulary with profound care. I am merely declaring that you challenged me to find the borderline. And I am currently situated precisely upon it, reading your formal constitutional pledge right next to your personal public statements. Additionally, I am unable to ignore the fact that you have abruptly turned completely quiet." A noticeable whisper moved across the citizen seating area. It had not yet transformed into chuckling, but the combined frequency was definitely floating toward that conclusion. He was not complete with his paperwork, and he raised one palm, not aimed at her as a shield, but rather a quiet, authoritative level motion, asking the larger chamber to contain its responses. "And prior to you trying to wave this away as past events," the speaker proceeded, "I would appreciate refreshing your recollection concerning the behaviors your personal political peers engaged in as a reaction. This exact establishment decided 2 years ago to remove you from your duties on the International Affairs Board. Currently, you fiercely labeled that choice as strictly factional maneuvering, and granted a segment of it certainly was. I refuse to attempt to untruthfully state otherwise. However, here is the exact element that stays embedded in my recollection. Once that reprimand was completed, you walked to the chamber floor, and you opted not to argue the substance of the ruling. That action would have been the sensible reaction. Rather, you stood in front of the room and you presented an inquiry to the whole assembly. You declared, and I carefully recorded this statement to guarantee pure precision, "This debate is about who gets to be an American." He raised his visual focus with intentional sluggishness. "It represents the absolute identical inquiry, echoed syllable for syllable. The same challenge written on this exact parchment you offered to me earlier this morning. You have been weaponizing that identical inquiry against this republic for multiple consecutive years, Congresswoman. And without missing a beat, every single occurrence you utilize it, it happens immediately after a person simply reads your personal disputed remarks back in your direction. That does not represent a random accident. That represents a strategic system. That exact inquiry functions as your emergency escape hatch. You run straight through it the minute the populace starts to recall what you legitimately vocalized." She stretched upward and tapped the audio monitor once again, a diminutive automatic movement, lodging it deeper against her auditory passage. She had performed the gesture a dozen instances that morning and was fated to perform it a dozen additional times. It manifested as the bodily habit of an individual desperate to remain linked to the broadcast, to the chamber, to the audio of her personal upper hand. She was not aware yet that the contraption only functioned as long as ambient sound existed for it to transmit. She had not yet recognized that the most lethal event that could occur to it was a chamber plunging into total, paralyzing quietness. That exact truth was currently roughly 30 minutes in the future. She had traversed this antagonistic environment before, though. She recognized this terrain. And she pivoted to the exact same strategy she reliably deployed whenever the ground moved under her. She tried to alter what the conflict was basically revolving around. I identify exactly what this represents, she deflected, and her tone temporarily regained its previous power, because fury was a territory where she had always felt protected. This constitutes nothing other than a religious nationalist preaching to a minority refugee concerning patriotism. You wish to discuss the founding document? Let us discuss the exact paragraphs you strategically bypass, the segments regarding faith. Because every single syllable you're currently vocalizing, you would never, not in a millennium, vocalize to a Caucasian, faithful male occupying the seat I am occupying. This does not represent valid accountability. This represents merely the most ancient narrative in this nation dressed in superior clothing. And every person observing acknowledges it. And grant her this credit because it was effective. The assembly shifted alongside her. It constituted a solid strike delivered by someone who had connected with it 100 occasions previously. An aide positioned exactly to her rear nodded vigorously. A reporter's writing instrument began moving rapidly. A female near the primary seating row, who had been leaning forward, currently settled backward unsure, the angle of the room flipping beneath her stance. The profoundly entrenched societal instinct was traveling through the space like an electrical pulse. The conditioned national recoil, the profound reflex to automatically withdraw from that provocative terminology rather than directly addressing the substance underneath it. That tightness remained for roughly 20 seconds, and it could have remained further. But the speaker did not recoil. He did not yield. And he absolutely did not perform the protective action the claim was designed to compel him to execute. He peacefully extracted his viewing spectacles, collapsed them, and placed them downward upon the desk adjacent to her manuscript. And when he vocalized, his volume had become exceptionally low, so low the assembly bodily tilted forward to capture it. "Representative," he directed toward her, "I am preparing to state a concept presently, and I require the citizens at their residences to process it slowly. I committed 8 years of my existence working as a legal advocate protecting the spiritual freedoms of individuals who were specifically not of my faith, Islamic individuals, Jewish individuals, citizens holding zero religious beliefs whatsoever. I stood resolutely within judicial halls and I battled for an Islamic male's entitlement to maintain his facial hair, and an Islamic young woman's entitlement to don her head covering within an educational facility that attempted to prohibit it. And I executed it because the First Amendment does not represent a Christian provision. It represents a national provision, and it protects you regardless of whether I participate in your specific belief system or otherwise." He maintained eye contact, declining to sever the connection. "Therefore, you selected the absolutely incorrect male to label a prejudiced individual regarding a head covering. I am the precise man who would have accepted your legal battle without financial compensation. I would have positioned myself between you and anyone who attempted to compel you to take your pledge upon a manuscript that did not belong to you." He allowed a single moment to elapse, which signifies you do not possess the right to deploy that exact terminology inside this chamber to escape from your personal inquiry. You willingly presented me this challenge. It revolves around a pledge. It does not revolve around your garment, and you recognize it does not. And grasping for that justification reveals the truth. The conditioned, protective recoil totally exited the chamber. What arrived to substitute it was vastly more damaging for her standing. It constituted authorization. That exact instance, a male who literally constructed his professional life protecting the spiritual freedoms of minority believers, plainly informing her she was forbidden to conceal herself behind the terminology she had concealed behind for decades, destroyed the facade. If you have ever observed an individual reach for heritage or belief to avoid a legitimate inquiry and hope that for once, a person would peacefully remove that exit portal, place one word into the comment section right this second. Just a single one. Input answered. Then remain engaged because she strikes back more fiercely than this and you require to observe it. "You sincerely desire to discuss my historical background?" She fired back, rapid, quiet, and enraged. "Now pay attention. I have dedicated my entire duration in this assembly battling for the benefit of citizens this administration neglected. I arrived in this republic holding nothing. Absolute zero. A displacement center, and subsequently a tiny single-room dwelling, and a vocabulary I was forced to acquire from broadcast programming. I secured my national status. I legitimately secured this position in a constituency that has elected me repeatedly. And you desire to distill all of that history and entire existence into a binder you produced this morning, so you could generate a trending video for individuals who will never recognize my identity and never desire to? I shall not express regret for the magnitude of the inquiries I present regarding this republic. Caring for a location signifies speaking the reality to it. And it was effective. For a brief second, it was authentically forceful, and a portion of the intensity returned to her half of the chamber. The official permitted her to complete. He permitted the entirety of it to settle in the atmosphere. And subsequently, for the very first instance the whole morning, the softness completely vanished from his inflection, and what surfaced from below was smooth, steady, and frigid. The protective barriers were removed and failed to return. No individual is diminishing your existence, Congresswoman. You arrived here holding zero and you constructed a legacy, and I would happily clasp your palm acknowledging that success in any parking area across the nation. That individual timeline does not sit under judgment. What sits actively under judgment is a singular specific item. The item you specifically demanded I uncover. He placed a lone digit atop her handwritten challenge and pushed it back to the exact middle of the desk dividing them, ensuring the recording devices captured it flawlessly. You continually inform me that caring for a location signifies speaking the reality to it. Acceptable. I shall accept that bargain. He reached backwards into the slender cardboard binder and extracted the subsequent sheet. Therefore, let us discuss a reality you vocalized publicly before an audience, formally logged on the transcript. Decades prior, at a financial gathering, you discussed the absolute most horrific daylight this republic has experienced during my existence. 3,000 citizens perished, parents, rescue workers. A man who merely embraced his offspring farewell and failed to return to his residence. He recited the wording monotonously, providing it zero emotion, which constituted the sole method it could be endured. And you characterized what occurred during that terrifying daylight as, exact quote, "Some people did something." He placed the sheet downward upon the timber. Some people did something. He permitted the heaviness of that sentence to rest inside the chamber for a second, and the chamber permitted it. Currently, I have processed the standard justification. I have processed the whole address, the complete background, the entirety of it. You were discussing societal freedoms for minority citizens in the wake of the event, and that constitutes a valid topic, and you held every entitlement to bring it up. I will concede you the entirety of that background. His inflection remained flawlessly flat. However, there existed vocabulary easily accessible to you that specific morning, Congresswoman. Clear vocabulary, slaughter, extremism, 3,000 deceased. You represent arguably the most articulate individual functioning inside this structure. You do not exhaust your supply of terminology. And the precise 4 words you grabbed for before a welcoming audience were, "Some people did something." He removed his spectacles downward. That does not represent a language barrier issue. That does not represent a video segment extracted vindictively missing its surroundings. That signifies a conscious decision concerning precisely how much gravity to assign the deceased. And the Republic listened to precisely how much gravity you granted them. Down within the 4th tier of the public seating, the male wearing the bland jacket had extracted the creased paper out of his garment pocket without entirely recognizing he had performed it, and was clutching it firmly utilizing both palms. It constituted an ancient copy, delicate at the folds resulting from being collapsed and opened an extended period. It constituted a portrait of a female. He failed to elevate his posture. He failed to vocalize a single syllable aloud. He simply clutched it where his eyes could view it. The exact manner you clutch an object when a person has finally stood publicly and vocalized aloud the phrase you had been hauling solitarily for decades. A male traveled via 2 transit vehicles to occupy a chair in an interrogation space and clutch a portrait of a person he was deprived of on that terrifying daylight. He never vocalized a syllable. He lacked the necessity to because the speaker vocalized it on his behalf. If that instance settled anywhere authentic for you, follow this broadcast immediately, because there exists one last sheet remaining inside that binder, and it constitutes the precise document that rendered the entire chamber soundless. The official placed 2 digits upon her handwritten challenge where it rested, separating them, securing it tightly in position so the recording devices captured it. There exists one additional instance, he declared, the most contemporary one, and this constitutes the specific example I would request the chamber to become silent for. Not to ridicule or chuckle, simply to listen. The chamber instantaneously became silent. A traditionalist male was assassinated the previous year, the official declared. Gunned downward before a crowd, gunned in view of his spouse. He represented a youthful parent departing 2 small children. You intensely opposed almost every concept that male held true, and you held every entitlement to. And I would have protected your entitlement to argue against him for the remainder of his biological existence. He gazed downward at the sheet, subsequently upward. However, he was not arguing that specific afternoon he was perishing, and during the torturous period following while his surviving spouse was frantically organizing the method to enter him, you appeared on broadcast multiple occasions, and you declared that his historical memory belonged inside the garbage receptacle of history. You specifically declared there existed 0 historical memory to respect. The offspring of an assassinated male are destined to mature and view that video clip one day, Congresswoman. They are destined to view an active representative of the national legislature inform the entire republic there existed absolutely nothing regarding their patriarch-deserving recollection, while his corpse remained heated. He placed the last sheet downward softly, similar to how he was placing a fragile object to slumber. I have protected repulsive vocabulary my entire professional life. I completely protect your lawful entitlement to vocalize even that statement. The lawful shield remains authentic. His volume descended an additional level. However, you specifically demanded I identify the border, and the border is not written into the legislative code. Ma'am, you were completely correct concerning that specific element. There exists no penal code you breached. The genuine border is the unseen boundary separating an individual who holds the lawful entitlement to speak a concept and an individual who holds the foundational human morality to refrain from doing so. You have dedicated a professional timeline standing resolutely upon the initial concept and acting as if it represents the latter. And I sincerely believe the citizens viewing this transmission can ultimately perceive the massive daylight dividing them. No individual chuckled at that statement. It descended somewhere substantially more profound than a chuckle, plunging into the sector of a chamber that determines fundamental concepts. She grabbed for the protected concept at that moment, the conversational maneuver that had never on a single occasion disappointed her, and the subsequent 60 seconds constituted the segment absolutely 0 individuals in that chamber anticipated, minimum of all herself. This entire dispute, she initiated, has never on a single occasion revolved around a pledge or an address or a digital post. It revolves around a basic foundational inquiry. Who holds the right to function as a citizen? It revolves around whether a minority female, a displaced person, is permitted to occupy this precise seat and present difficult inquiries without continuously being informed You performed in reality. Present a difficult inquiry, the official interrupted. Silence. He failed to elevate his volume above hers. He simply placed his vocabulary softly beneath hers. And she paused, primarily because you lacked the ability to effectively speak above how crushingly quiet his tone registered. You officially demanded I identify the border, and I have committed the previous 2/3 of an hour plainly responding to every solitary syllable of it, using proof solely from your personal lips and your personal sworn pledge. Not a single reality I manufactured, not a single quotation I warped missing its surroundings. You willingly delivered me this task. He lifted her handwritten document, the initial challenge, and elevated it so the entire chamber could witness her personal script scrawled upon it. And the conclusive response to your challenge, Representative, is that you have been insisting the Republic confuse your lawful entitlements for your ethical behavior for decades. And the whole Republic simply observed you try it a final instance in active time, and they observed it collapse. He placed the document downward. "You demanded." The Republic responded. 4 basic syllables, and they achieved exactly what 400 failed to accomplish. She reached for the earpiece instinctively. It was not a calculated move, but a reflexive reaction to the deafening silence of the room, a desperate attempt to find the only remaining source of audio. But the chamber was so profoundly quiet that the device had nothing to transmit. Trapped in that stillness, it caught its own internal frequency and began to shriek. It was a sharp, rising electronic squeal in a room so silent you could hear a pin drop. Cameras captured her physical flinch. She pressed her hand against it, trying to muffle the sound, but the pitch only climbed. Finally, she yanked the plastic device from her ear. The noise instantly ceased, yet the crushing silence that followed felt infinitely worse. Paralyzed, she stared at the dead piece of technology that had betrayed her in her most vulnerable moment. Carefully, she placed it on the wooden desk, folded her hands in her lap, and remained completely mute. When the chairman gently asked if she wished to continue her questioning, she declined. That piercing whine on national television was the undeniable sound of her own trap snapping shut. The aftermath in the political sphere proved just how devastating the moment was. By the time the hearing ended, a perfectly cut short video clip was already circulating rapidly online. It featured her confident smirk, his methodical destruction of her argument using her own words, and her frantic struggle with the screaming earpiece. By afternoon, the footage dominated every digital platform. The most terrifying aspect for her was the public reaction. There was no fierce debate over geopolitical policies or prejudice. There was nothing left to argue. He had meticulously answered her challenge. The evening news broadcast universally played the silent clip accompanied by 4 simple words. "You asked, America answered."